This is the State of the Union for November 2023. Caging results, we are still waiting on finalized numbers, but right now it's looking like revenue is going to be down about 12%, October versus October, 22 versus 23, with donations down about 15% and average gift up 3%. As we usually caveat these numbers, this is also in part because mail volumes have gone down over this time, but definitely something to keep an eye on. Wanted to highlight this from our production solutions folks. They gave me an update on paper and production. Spoiler alert, it's a little bit rosier than we've had in last year, especially. So looks like we are maintaining price stability through the end of the year. This year, there was this decline in demand, and so mills scheduled some downtime and using down their existing inventory. But those stocks have diminished somewhat. They're starting to see an uptick in demand again. And so market will probably tighten a little bit in the short term, but not to the point of huge price gains unless there's something odd going on as we've had in the past. A lot of paper mills are trying to consolidate their stock. One of the things that they're saying is, hey, why don't we focus on some of our higher margin products? And so there may not be as much specialty stock out there where there's a cost that's going in. And then we're keeping an eye on coated paper because there is a kind of oligopoly or a biopoly in that market with two mills controlling 89% of the domestic market. And so coated paper product, which isn't most of what we use, but it is something we keep an eye on, could be a little bit more, could have more fluctuation than the rest of it. We're back to pre-pandemic levels with lead times. There's not as much of a get your orders in now for 2025 mailings as there was during the pandemic. Logistics has been fairly stable, but we are seeing a little bit of price increases right in line, quite honestly, with inflation and honestly a lower inflation rate. One of the things that we are also seeing is a greater investment in automation. So how do we get more out of the same amount of input, both physical and labor inputs to that? And so looking into our crystal balls, we're not expecting any production cost increases in Q4 and Q1 up to 2%. So kind of going back to those pre-pandemic levels for our costs is what we're projecting. Any questions on that? Obviously, the notes, and the third bullet point here, I think, is especially prescient. If you're doing programmatic work, that those triggered mailings, getting that in ahead of time because you do need to order stock ahead of time on those sorts of things, or pre-printing for emergency responses, knowing that there's going to be an emergency, but not knowing necessarily what that emergency is. Those sorts of things are good to be planning ahead for and taking advantage of fairly flat market. Any questions or comments on any of that? Okay, so our friends over at the Agitator blog, where I used to be an editor, always good content over there, had a post a little while ago about payment methods and how the check is dying out and it's only 4% of total transactions. So I wanted to dig into the payment method distribution there and see what's going on and how it impacts our market. Spoiler alert, I think a lot of their ideas are right, teaching people how to use QR codes, getting to more sustainable payment methods, but not saying the check is dead by any means. So looking at how Americans have bought things in the past 30 days, 46% of Americans say they've used a check for something. Cash, credit, debit are the most common ways of paying for things. Interestingly, while checks are 4% of the volume, and this was a number that the Agitator focused on, they're 11% of the value of payments. The average amount paid for with a check is substantially higher. Now, that's probably the nature of where people are still using checks. Charities are the number two, but contractors are number one. That plumber comes to your house, you have an electrician, and those sorts of things. That's the most common place to use a check. And I would say that a lot of what you see for these top places that we're still using checks are places that people are still asking for checks. Plumbers still asking for a check. You still pay your water bill or your rent with a check. You still pay for some government services with a check. And then we are actively asking for checks in our mail pieces. And so it all kind of makes sense there. It also goes along with the demographics that we have. And one thing to be aware of is if we're asking for checks as a main part of how we're asking for gifts, that's somewhat self-selecting for who's going to be responding to those. And so over half of people who self-identify as white have written a check in the past month. Less than a quarter of people who self-identify as black, with Asian and Hispanic somewhere in the middle, but tending toward that lower amount. And so part of this is that we're asking. And so, but part of it is the way that we are asking is probably reflecting in who's responding. And so having those other options in there, we've talked in previous State of the Unions about people who get the appeal offline and go online. That tends to be a younger and more racially and ethnically diverse audience. The more that we can make that a frictionless process, the better off for things. Any questions about payment methods?
They really didn't cover, Nick, Zelle or Venmo, which some people are doing that, maybe not necessarily for donations, but just like for contractors. A lot of the contractors now will take a Zelle or a Venmo. And
Yep.
It's interesting. I'm hearing from people trying to get Venmo added to their remits. And I think that's an interesting piece of it. And then also you've got people who want to do PayPal. So
Yep. And PayPal's been a big one for a number of years. In a lot of cases, organizations who have PayPal enabled on their donation form actually find that it will sometimes surpass MasterCard, sometimes surpass Amex on the sometimes around the third most common payment method online. Apple Pay is one that folks are requesting as well. Venmo. Uh, the challenge there's a challenge of the proliferation to a couple of the big ones. Apple Pay, Venmo, I think are probably two good ones. If you can have that built into your donation page, that's something that's really helpful. And then with offline activity, if you have that, you can say for the person who makes those types of donations, hey, scan this QR code, and we do take Venmo, we do take Apple Pay, or whatever that is online. Um, One of the things that I was thinking about in the context of this can potentially down the road be a customization point. So if someone has received the offline mail piece, they've gone online, they've used PayPal, for example,
mhm.
on that buck slip, put the QR code, put the URL, and say, and we accept PayPal as a reminder, just so that you're doing that additional showing that you knowing and bringing friction out of the process. So, good opportunity there and well put about some of the electronic payment systems.
Thank you.
No problem. One of the things that's interesting about that is that whether it's regulation or cultural or those sorts of things, there many other countries are far farther down electronic payment systems than we are, whether it's touch to tap to pay or whether it is in-app pay or those sorts of things. And so it's definitely something that is going to be picking up the the challenge, I will guess, will be a standard if we can coalesce around what's the equivalent of our Visa, Amex, Mastercard in the payment space. Then there was an interesting study that came out about how identity is impacting charitable giving, and it's one of the few, and in fact, perhaps the only that I've seen that looks at it the opposite direction of how I usually look at it. So I usually think of identity and charitable giving as people who are like this tend to give in this way. They look at it the opposite, and they're asking people, what do you feel is um, the type of organization that someone of your gender, of your age category, and of your political persuasion would give to? And so then taking that backwards and looking at, do people in those groups actually give to those charities kind of as a result of how they've identified things? So looking at this, you can see anything with 3 stars over it is statistically significant at a pretty high level. But 5 times as many men as women identified political groups as a target of male giving. 4 times as many men as women said their gender group gave to sports and to recreation charities. 3 times as many women as men identified animal protection and cultural and arts charities, and twice as many women as men said social service charities were typically supported by their gender group. Looking at age, and I believe they put the cutoff at 40 here, so I'm in the older group for this study. Made me feel really happy about that. 6 times as many young people as old people say, I'm sorry, old people as young people say they support religious organizations. Twice as many older people as younger people said they support health, charities, and political causes. And then on the flip side, 6 times as many of the younger group than the older group said people in their age group support sports and recreation charities. And that's about twice as much for education, environmental, and animal protection. Not And then conservative versus progressive, 3 times as many conservatives as progressives say people like me support religious organizations. About twice as many progressives as conservatives say that their political group would support environmental organizations, animal protection, civic and advocacy groups, and development and housing charities. And so interesting to see. Obviously, those line up to a greater or lesser extent with how people give, but looking at it for the lens of what people identify themselves as, and then the people like me do things like this. How is it compelling? So having those, um, they also found, and there was also a religious group, but the religious differences weren't as significant. So I didn't put that in here. There was weak alignment between, I said this group was given to me by gender more, and therefore I'm more likely to give it to it. Um, so social services, animal charities, education and research, and religious on sex, all significant. The rest not as much. For younger, older, religious was real, political was real, research and culture were both real. Um, but political was rather more highly predictive. Only 13% of the people of the giving that people reported went against their perceived identity as either progressive or conservative. And so this is the first uh, study that kind of goes in this direction. And so there are some implications here. When the identity is working with you, you can work to prime it as a conservative, as a religious person. I know that in work with Catholic Relief Services, um, way back when, obviously, priming religious identity is significant for that organization. And if you know that about a person, that's a type of identity that you can prime either for them, or you can prime it in the kind of story that you're using. This is an older person like you. type thing without saying that as much. You can also build this into your modeling. If someone thinks they should be giving to an organization, they're more likely to give to that organization, so you can target that. But at the same time, we also want to, a lot of our organization want to reach across gender lines, across age lines, even across political lines. And so it may be incumbent upon us, as we're showing who's a donor in CTV ads, DRTV ads, video ads, that sort of thing, that person who is handing in, I was going to say the check, handing in the check, giving a debit card, entering their Venmo information to a computer. If someone sees someone who looks like them, we may be able to change some of these preconceived notions about who gives to a cultural organization, who gives to an environmental organization. Any questions there? As ever, a lot of interesting AI and machine learning research out there, as well as stories. Scarlett Johansson is perhaps the first celebrity to sue an app for using their likeness. So the app is called Lisa AI Yearbook and Avatar. It allows people to post airbrushed pictures of themselves. And their ad said, "What's up, guys? It's Scarlett, and I want you to come with me." It started with actual footage of Scarlett Johansson and then used kind of an uncanny valley approximation of the actor. And so they were probably pretty blatantly using this doppelganger, and she and her lawyers did not take kindly to that. This will probably only increase over time. There is an interesting study out that says that if you prime language models with emotional prompts as part of it, like "this is very important to my career," you can get better results. And so you can see on the graph on the left, the vanilla versus the emotional prompt performed better in overall performance, in truthfulness and responsibility. And there were only a couple of problems where the emotional prompt didn't do better. Out of 30, 28, it performed better on all measures with significant relative gains. And there were a lot of different ways that it looked at priming emotions, but this was the best summary that I saw of this. Um, you could add things like, "This is very important to my career. You better be sure. Take pride in your work and give it your best. Your commitment to excellence sets you apart. And are you sure that's your final answer? Your hard work will yield remarkable results." Different phrases work. Emotional phrases almost always work better, but different phrases work better in different contexts. Basically said, this is prompt magic in the paper. And the summary of it is like, AI, like, literally says at the end, AI is weird sometimes. And my best guess is all of the training data that we're putting in comes from humans. And if humans perform better, if you prime them on emotions, it may be that these learning models also tend to perform better as a result. But some interesting results there. Study came out asking 4 pastors, a rabbi, 13 academics, and I swear this is not the beginning of a joke, 50 Wharton MBA students. Questions that were submitted to the New York Times column as The Ethicist versus GPT-4 as a result. And by and large, people tended to prefer, only slightly though, the AI results rather than the actual human ethicist. So human results from the author of the column, along with AI results, people preferred the GPT-4 model slightly, not significantly. But the fact that it's even in the same neighborhood is who would have thought would be here a year ago. Then there's a lot of research done in Amazon's Mechanical Turk to get subjects. And one of the things that we're seeing now is in these studies, about 30% of human workers. And the idea of Mechanical Turk is you go to humans for tasks and pay in kind of micropayments. And so someone can build those up over time. Well, they're using these large language models, ChatGPT and things like that, like everyone else. And so the whole goal of the research is try to get a human's viewpoint on it. And the humans are giving you an artificial intelligence viewpoint on it. And then if you are interested in AI, the state of .ai report came out last month and is quite excellent and in nauseating depth to the point that I can't get into all of it here. So highly recommend a look through. Some of it is rather technical, but it's a great viewpoint on the state of the market, state of play, how it impacts politics, what regulations are coming, those sorts of things. Any questions on any of that? Because we're headed to the potpourri / nonsense segment. Okay. You may recall about 7 months ago, NPR quit what was then Twitter. So this was over Twitter giving it the designation a U.S. state-affiliated media, and NPR is, well, it's not. So NPR stopped posting on April 4th. A week later, it posted its last update saying, here's where you can get us on the other social networks. A lot of member stations also pulled out from Twitter at that point. And so they just released a memo to all of their member stations talking about the impact that had had. Traffic dropped by a single percentage point because of X. And so NPR did have 8.7 million followers, and the NPR Politics had 3 million followers. Because of how the algorithm had changed and because of the challenging of linking out, they just didn't miss the traffic from it. So interesting from an internet perspective. The Sweden Tourism Council is running an ad campaign called Welcome to Sweden, Not Switzerland. Apparently 120,000 people each year Google whether Sweden and Switzerland are the same country. And a study conducted by Visit Sweden found that about half of U.S. natives said, I don't know if there's a difference between the two countries. And so they're running videos that are things like, let's delineate who can talk about what topics. So Switzerland can talk about mountaintops and yodeling and watches, and Sweden will take rooftop bars and forgetting about time. Switzerland has gold reserves. Sweden has forest gold in chanterelle mushrooms, and just a very tongue-in-cheek look at the differentiation there. But it does remind me of the embassies of Slovenia and Slovenian exchange mail that was intended for the other embassies. So they don't have a monopoly on this. Doritos, about 85% of US gamers have said they've been consumed Doritos in the last 3 months, and nearly a third of gamers have said that other people's crunching on microphones has impacted their gameplay. And so Doritos is debuting a crunch cancellation software that will nullify the sound of Dorito crunching over PlayStation and Xbox microphones. Ain't technology wonderful? And then finally, Nikon sponsors each year a competition for micro photography. So what you see on the left is a colorized, this is the number 1 winner on the left, number 2 is on the right. Left is the rodent optic nerve head. And on the right, if you look closely, you may be able to figure this one out. It's a matchstick igniting by the friction on the surface of the box. So if you want to see more cool photos like this, go to nikonsmallworld.com. No promotional consideration for any of this.